Coat the front bearing area of the shaft with Molykote grease. Place the shaft upright in a hydraulic press with the spline end down. Unwrap the front bearing assembly and place it over the shaft with the shield side up. Pressing on the inner race only, press it onto the shaft until seated against the shaft shoulder. Place the bearing spacer over the shaft onto the bearing. Coat the shaft rear bearing area with Molykote grease. Slip the rear bearing over the shaft with the shield side down. Pressing on the inner race only, press it onto the shaft until it seats against the spacer and front bearing. Place the shaft upright in a hydraulic press with the spline end down. Coat the front bearing area of the shaft with Molykote grease. Unwrap the front bearing assembly. Do not interchange parts of one bearing assembly with another. These parts are precisely matched in manufacture and must be installed as a matched assembly. All parts on both the front and back bearings are marked with a serial number. The front bearings also have an A and B side. All parts with the A following the serial number are to be assembled to the A side of the cup. Lift the cone and roller assembly out of the bearing stack and place it on the shaft with the large radius on the inside diameter of the cone down. Pressing on the cone only, press it onto the shaft until it's seated against the shaft shoulder. Place the spacer over the shaft on the bearing cone. Place the bearing cup over the cone and roller assembly, keeping the cup oriented with the proper roller assembly. Coat the remaining bearing cone and roller inside diameter with Molykote grease and slip them over the shaft with the large radius on the inside diameter of the cone up. Pressing on the cone only, press it onto the shaft and into the cup until the cone is seated against the spacer and the other cone assembly. For shafts with front bearing lock nuts, apply Molykote grease to the threaded area on the shaft and to the face of the lock nut. Install the spacer washer, lock washer, and lock nut finger tight. Clamp the shaft behind the lock nut in a soft-jawed vise and drive the lock nut tight using a spanner wrench or drift. Refer to Table 2 in the Operation and Maintenance Manual for tightening torque. Place the shaft upright in a hydraulic press with the spline end down. Slip on the grease retainer with the flange up. On the 320 series, install the spacer before the grease seal. Coat the shaft bearing area with Molykote grease. Unwrap the rear bearing assembly. Do not interchange parts of one bearing assembly with another. These parts are precisely matched in manufacture and must be installed as a matched assembly. Lift the cone and roller assembly out of the bearing stack and place it on the shaft with the large radius on the inside diameter of the cone down. Pressing on the cone only, press it onto the shaft until it's seated. Apply Molykote grease again. Slip the bearing cup over the roller assembly. Install both the inner and outer spacers. Place the remaining cup onto the outer spacer. Pressing on the cone only, press it onto the shaft until it's seated, making sure the outer spacer is concentric on the shaft. Place the bearing housing on an arbor press. For pumps without bearing spacers, install the front bearing grease seals with the lip toward the center of the cavity, flush with the back face of the bore. Coat the lip seals with microplate grease number 555. The next step involves shimming, which is a most critical step, and if done properly, will assure the correct front face and back face clearances for trouble-free operation. There are three basic methods of shimming. The first method is used when the existing old shaft is to be reused. By using the very same shims as were on the existing shaft and bearing assembly, it's highly likely that there will be no change in the shim thickness required, even if the front bearings are replaced. The second method is used when replacing the existing shaft with a new shaft. This method requires a precise measurement of the existing old shaft and bearing assembly from the rotor shoulder on the shaft to behind the last shim. This same measurement can be accomplished on the new shaft and bearing assembly by adding or subtracting shims. When this shimmed new shaft and bearing assembly is installed in the gear case, the correct or nearly correct front face and back face clearances can be expected. The last method is described in the Operation and Maintenance Manual and involves adding an estimated amount of shims per Table 3, also found in the Operation and Maintenance Manual. This method may require disassembly and reassembly to achieve the correct amount of shimming required. Install the shaft assemblies in the bearing housing with the spline end up and the drive shaft in proper location to give top or bottom drive as required. Using a sleeve to press against the outer race, press the shafts into the housing until seated against the shim pack. Grease the front and rear bearings through the grease fittings until the grease is visible around the ball or roller assemblies. Install the grease seals in the bearing retainers and coat the seal lip with microplate grease number 555. Secure the shaft assemblies in the housing with bearing retainers. Check to make sure there's clearance between the retainer and the housing. Install the pump body and rotors. Check the back face clearance. Refer to page 42 and Table 1 for the clearance required. Add or subtract shims as required to set the back face clearance. Remove the rotors and the body. Check the clearance between the bearing retainers and the bearing housing. Series 15 and 30 need 40 thousandths to 50 thousandths inch clearance. Series 60, 130, 220, and 320 need 15 thousandths to 40 thousandths inch clearance. Install shims between the bearing and retainer if required. Remove the bearing retainer and install a gasket or O-ring as required. Reinstall the bearing retainers. Install spacer seals and gear spacers. Coat the lip of the rear bearing seal. Press in the rear seals with the lip facing out. On Series 15, 30, 60, 130, and 320 pumps, the rear seal is pressed flush with the housing. On Series 220 pumps, the seal must not be flush. It must be 1/8 of an inch outside of the housing. Place the keys into the shaft key slot. Install the gear with the single punch mark onto the drive shaft and the gear with 2 punch marks onto the short shaft with the punch marks straddling the single mark of the drive gear. Apply Molykote grease to the threaded area on the shafts and to the face of the lock nuts. Slip on the lock washers and lock nuts. Tighten the lock nuts with a spanner wrench or drift. Refer to Table 2 for tightening torque. Bend the locking tabs to secure the lock nuts. Press a new grease seal into the gear cover. Place the gasket over the gear cover and mount the cover assembly over the shaft extension onto the bearing housing. Fill the gear cavity with microplate number 140 oil to the proper level. You are now part of the Waukesha Pumps tradition. By following these procedures, your Waukesha Pumps will provide long, trouble-free service.